Hello and welcome to Treecat Reacts. Your hosts today are Michelle and Lucie. They're about to react to a really interesting video. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more awesome content. Without further ado, enjoy the show.
Hi, it's Lucie and
Michelle,
and we're here with Treecat. I have a video on thrifting and the history of thrifting that I think is just to die for, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear about it. And
it's called The Dirty History Behind Thrifted Clothing by Nicole Rudolph on YouTube.
Amazing person. So let's listen. She has sources in the description. She's got a lot to do. So
she has a lot to say.
Thrifting has become an incredibly popular thing, especially over the last decade or so. It has grown into an entire community and culture of reusing, altering, digging for treasures, and it is seen as a great way to do everything from helping the environment to helping your budget, as well as just being creative. But it hasn't always been viewed like that. In fact, just a century or two ago, it was something that was considered only by the most desperate. So what happened in such a very short period of time to take used clothing from taboo to trend? Well, first up, we need to understand that the secondhand market has always been around. It was really formalized between the 14th and 15th centuries in most of Europe, but it has always been with us in some format or another, just because up until the 19th century, it was fabric that was incredibly expensive, not the clothing being made up. So for the vast majority of people well into the 19th century, their clothing was being custom made. That's because you would go buy the fabric, choose how much you're spending or not, and then the making up was much less expensive. They didn't really have ready-made clothing up until that point either, aside from things like slops and workwear, which I actually talked a lot more about in the pirate fashion video I did a while back. But outside of things like sailors' work garments, there wasn't anything really available pre-made with the exception of basic undergarments, which was one of the things that was mass-produced because it was generally unfitted, it could come in sizes, it was really basic shapes to make up, and it was absolutely necessary. Of course, it was not that long ago that we didn't have things like deodorant, so undergarments and washing them regularly, changing them out all the time was a really necessary thing. Thankfully, we don't have that problem anymore. The secondhand clothing options that were out there were very often demeaned for the fact that they were seen as unclean and dangerous options. They had a pretty terrible reputation.
Do you clean your clothing that you resell?
Of course. Yeah.
So you're defying the 14th century stereotype.
I think, does this have something to do with smallpox? The fact that people were getting smallpox from blankets and from textiles? I wonder if that's the reason why they thought used clothing was
Maybe
dangerous.
We should keep watching and see what they think about illness.
Let's find out.
So they existed in large numbers, especially in bigger cities. London had multiple neighborhoods over the years that contained entire sections of secondhand clothing markets. Places like Bridgegate, Houndsditch, or eventually the East London Old Clothes Exchange. New York, too, developed quite a market of its own. Chatham Street in particular became well known for it. So these shops were incredibly prevalent because they needed to be. Not everyone could afford brand new fabric, nor did they necessarily have garments that had been passed down through generations of use, with remaking things pulled out of the attic from 50 years earlier, and especially with 19th century industrial growth, where these cities brought in so many new people, and there was a lot of immigration and a lot of industrial centers where so many people could barely afford what they needed. They became an absolute necessity. And this really wouldn't start.
And today, I think that used clothing clothing sellers are absolutely essential. Like if we were to only buy fast fashion, we would not have clothing that lasts. We would have clothing that disintegrates fast, and it would be really bad for the environment, for everyone.
Yeah.
I think we're doing an incredibly important thing here.
I think so.
To shift until the mid-19th century where we start seeing a lot more ready-made clothing. And price-wise, that will eventually create an entire market of much less expensive clothing that a lot more of the population can afford, so fewer and fewer people will end up needing the secondhand markets in the same way. But before that becomes a really normal part of our 20th century experience, the 19th century was still dealing with the fact that there just wasn't affordable clothing. And in fact, there was such a large quantity of secondhand clothing being created in these large cities that they started shipping things internationally. London was...
That's still being done today. There's still people that go to the bins and they ship suitcases, clothing, shoes to Africa, Philippines, all different places.
Not to mention clothing from like Goodwill and Value Village. They ship a good portion of overseas anyway for free. So it's still happening.
Yeah, still happening today.
Was shipping clothing to America, to the rest of Europe, and to Ireland. In Ireland, this is actually where the term hand-me-down or reach-me-down comes from, because it's referring to clothing that is pre-made and can be handed down from a shelf or from the peg. Eventually, it comes to mean secondhand clothing in the direct sense of handing something down through the generations, but that's where the term initially comes from, because that sort of trade.
Can you imagine having clothing that your grandmother or great-grandmother wore? Like it lasts that long. I can't even imagine that.
This is the second time my dad has bought the same shirt in his lifetime. This is only in a couple years.
Yeah.
So even one person in their lifetime.
It's hard to believe that clothing lasts. There's clothing that can last generations. That's amazing.
Let's just talk about quality, you know?
Okay.
All right.
It was such an integral part of Ireland's experience of the 19th century. Same goes for westward America. That term made its way over here as well. And as people moved further and further west, they needed clothing to keep up with them, but there just wasn't the same supply that there was on the East Coast with the major cities. So it became absolutely necessary for them to have secondhand clothing being shipped out there in large quantities. Most of the old clothing gets sourced in and sold by three different types of people. You have first and foremost the pawnbrokers, who will temporarily take in clothing, charge interest, and ideally return it to the person who dropped it off first. But in a lot of cases, they never come back and they end up selling that clothing. You also have just secondhand clothiers that specifically work in used goods, sometimes specifically just in used clothing. And there's also what they call old clo men, who wander the streets and ask for any old clothes. They will purchase them and very often will take those back to those more permanent stores or markets. There's another group in addition to this that deals in rags. Very often, though, that is a donated situation or very little money that is actually being made off of these clothing items that are well past the point of actually being of good use. So they are sort of separated out because they're not in the end selling clothing back to people. These stores had a less than ideal reputation in the 19th century, but there was a lot of additional judgment as to the reputation of these stores who own and ran them. There's also a fair bit of judgment over the amount of money being made in these trades. Some articles will claim that they make so much money just ripping off all of these really needy people, but usually when they actually have articles supposedly interviewing people who are actually in the trade, they got really into doing that in the 1880s. I think there was a bit of a shift trying to happen with understanding the trade, and media was very interested in.
Would you say, as a reseller, that people understand what you do and that they treat it kindly?
I would say that from a lot of people, when I would tell them what I did, they would be like, okay. And they would like walk away sometimes. I just did not want to talk to you. I was actually really surprised at the reaction.
So because of this history to it, because of this idea that people don't even know that that's the reason why people feel so uncomfortable with used clothing, with people who sell used clothing, but that's where it comes from. And people don't even realize
from the 1800s.
From the 1800s, and that's still lasting today.
That's crazy.
Isn't that wild?
In sort of telling the story to help people understand and destigmatize it a bit. And so as they were talking to these owners, they found that they usually purchased things at, yes, a very low amount, usually around 1/8 of the original purchase price, but these again are used items, some more, some less used. And most of the goods were actually coming from the wealthy, those that would only wear these garments for a season or two.
Would you say that nowadays that a lot of your items come from the wealthy?
I would say that there's a very wealthy population here where we live, and that's why I'm able to get such awesome items at the bins. And so, yeah, probably.
Would you say that in general? Do you think that a lot of the used clothing comes from wealthy people trying to keep up with fashion trends?
Yeah, could be. It's a good point.
Let's hear more about the past.
To not want the style anymore. It's not on trend. It's not
those micro trends that the 18th century
at that point in time. So they will actually sell
also, those are not how waist
clothing to these secondhand dealers at a very small amount, but it's enough for them to then go and put a little bit down towards the next season's clothing. So it wasn't just purchasing from the absolutely needy who were desperate for a little bit of money, but they were also purchasing from those that were simply using it as spending money. The wealthy also preferred their clothing to go to secondhand dealers, in part because it so often was shipped pretty far away. So something that was sold in New York would very often end up in a place like St. Louis, where the person who sold it didn't have to worry about that ball gown that everyone was talking about last fall being seen on somebody else. And a lot of the clothing that they were getting rid of wasn't something that they could necessarily pass down to their servants or to other people because it just wasn't something that was practical.
So I don't know if you're aware of this, but Kim Kardashian actually started out as a reseller. She would resell her clothing and other people's clothing online on eBay because it
was expensive clothing.
It was expensive clothing, and they only wanted to be seen wearing it once.
Didn't she work for like celebrities
Paris Hilton or something?
Yeah, that makes sense.
She was a business person.
Yeah, well,
she was an entrepreneur.
Yep.
A silk ball gown or a really nice summer dress isn't necessarily something that's very practical for most people. So it made a lot of sense that they sold these things into the secondhand trade. They also obviously got their clothing, yes, sometimes from people that were pretty desperate for a little bit of cash right now, and this was the only thing that they really had to sell. They also definitely had some issues with stolen goods coming in, though most of the discussion said that it was pretty obvious when that happened and wasn't that big of an issue since most of the people had been in the trade for so long they could tell who was suspicious.
That's still an issue today, stolen goods being sold online.
Yeah, especially like a few years ago when people were just stealing from the stores. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember when you bought a stolen calculator by accident.
Yeah, I actually went to a pawn store to buy a calculator. And when I sold it back to that same pawn store, they're like, this is stolen. And I was like, I bought it from you.
So this is still a problem. Things that happened in the past are still perpetuating today, which is why some of these stereotypes haven't gone away. If you are a reseller and you feel like you've been stigmatized because of your job, this is why. This is what's happening.
Fascinating.
Much money off of these goods that most of the time when things came in, they only had a pretty small markup. Something that they bought for $3 would only get sold for $5, or even the more expensive things that they would buy for $40 would get sold for $70. And they still had to go through the entire process of cleaning and repairing and preparing these garments for sale, because they didn't just buy them and directly put them up for sale. They often would wait a whole season, so that way something like a winter.
Does that sound familiar? Waiting a whole season to sell stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I'll source Christmas stuff in the summer a lot, Christmas sweaters and things like that, because that's when they're cheap and people are, that's when
winter coat would make better money. And they also needed to go through the process of making sure that they were in a sellable state. So the clothing would first get washed and cleaned, then it would go to a clobberer who would patch and sew up whatever repairs were needed. Sometimes these garments would go to a reviver who would re-dye the garment. This was commonly the case with black clothing, as it would start to fade and need a little bit of a refresh. There might also be a translator involved in the process who would completely remake the garment. They might use multiple things in order.
I think a lot of this has changed with these luxury brands. When people are going to buy something like nice online, they're not looking for, oh, that necessarily looks nice. A lot of the time they're looking for, oh, what brand is that?
Have you heard Coach is actually doing a similar thing to what they're talking about? Coach, the purse maker, they're taking some of the styles that didn't go over well, some of the materials that they have extra, and they're making like a new line of all these repurposed, recycled materials. It's actually really interesting.
That is interesting. Although I do feel like that is a little bit different, as Coach is trying to just continuously profit on their own merchandise, whereas these people who are resellers like you are taking something that was no longer wanted and making it new for cheaper.
Well, I mean, but Coaches, that's what Coaches
are
doing.
they selling them for cheaper?
They're not really selling them that cheap.
There you go. Okay.
But it's a neat idea.
To make
it's
an entirely new piece, so that way it would also not knowably be someone else's clothing. Now, despite the fact that for the vast majority of the clothing in the secondhand trade, it went through cleaning and repair and a whole lot of effort to get it to a nice, usable state, there was still a very strong stigma around the whole thing. In fact, they generally found as people came in to purchase clothing, those that were more on the middle class range would still come in, but they would often claim it was being purchased for a relative. They don't need this, their aunt needs this, or they essentially need something that's just a functional garment for a practical purpose, but they're actually just buying a silk cloak. So they would make excuses so that way they felt less embarrassed about it. And for that reason, a lot of buying and selling was actually done pretty quietly. So that way it was not obvious that someone was selling a large quantity of their clothing, in which case people would become suspicious that they.
I mean, this is why we don't hear a lot about the history of reselling, because it was so hush-hush. It was so under the table. Which is why
it didn't really become cool until a few years ago, right? And then you were like, let's go thrifting, Mom.
A large part of their customer base were the people that were in the working class that needed just functional clothing, maybe for nicer events. They also had a really big business with the immigrant population who would sometimes come over wearing clothing that was distinct to wherever they came from, and they wanted to fit in very quickly. So that made it feasible for them to buy an entire suit of clothing right off the boat. There's also an entire customer section of theatrical use. So theaters would regularly go and buy secondhand clothing. And this is actually fascinating. If you've ever looked at those images of dance hall girls from around the turn of the century, and you see these exquisite, expensive costumes covered in embroidery and sequins, they look like they would just cost a fortune to make. How could they possibly have managed that on a theatrical budget? Well, the answer is they would take these old fancy ball gowns from very wealthy ladies and adjust them. So it's just shortening the skirt and changing out some of the trimming so it's a little bit more readable on the stage. So that is actually where a lot of those fancy gowns likely went. Despite the fact that all of this stuff is managed and sorted and cleaned and repaired, it still had a very strong reputation of bad hygiene, in large part because they were.
Is that something you've noticed as a reseller, that people think that it's going to be like not cleaned properly, or like it's going to be gross?
I haven't noticed that. No,
that's good. That's good.
Maybe just because I do a good job with my.
I know. I'm just wondering if there's like a stigma, because it seems like there used to be.
I don't know. I don't think so.
Were some people who were in the trade that were doing some more than sketchy things. Sometimes the clothing wasn't stored correctly. Sometimes.
Although you make a good point, because Mercari just did sort of a test where they are allowing for a certain amount of time, they allowed people to return things if they smelled bad. They don't, because Mercari doesn't have returns, but they decided to change that for a short amount of time. They did a test run and they allowed people to return it if it was not as described or if it smelled.
How can you prove that something smelled bad? That just seems like it's ripe for people to scam.
Right.
And bugs and other illnesses were definitely a big concern. Even dry cleaning today struggles to clean things like the inside of pockets. So there was a major concern that things like tuberculosis could manage to make their way into those more hidden areas of the garment, wouldn't get washed out properly, and things like that could be transferred from person to person. Pests were also obviously a constant issue, fleas and things like that. Despite the fact that they tried to shut down the less than savory shops, there wasn't a strong regulation of everything. But there was another movement that was starting to take place throughout the 19th century that would take the idea of secondhand clothing from judgment to charity. Starting early in the 19th century, a lot of charitable organizations, whether organized through things like a church or a sewing group or other sorts of little societies, were looking for ways that they could help those that were in need. And if it wasn't setting up entire things like the Ragged Schools in London that started up in 1844, where they would put out direct requests for used clothing that could be given to the students of their school, the alternative was to do things like rummage sales. They started off by asking for homemade goods, but they eventually grew into asking for secondhand goods. And that became a much more popular thing as the 19th century went on, as clothing became a little bit less expensive, a little bit more readily available. Same thing with other goods, and things went in and out of style very quickly, so there were a lot more things for people to willingly throw away that were still in decent condition, and they liked the idea of being able to feel good about doing it. So these groups started to take in a lot of secondhand clothing to give away for free to those in need. One of the major shifts in this takes place with Goodwill. And
We all know about
Goodwill
Goodwill.
Industries was formally created in 1902 in Boston. And they would specifically go to the wealthy to get donations and hand those out for free. And eventually they started to charge a small amount for what they had rather than giving it away for free. And they used that money in order to help with operations fees. So that way they could hire in people to do the cleaning and the repair and the remaking. It also allowed them to open up separate shops. So they actually ended up creating a more department store-like situation, much cleaner and more modern. So people felt a lot more comfortable about going in and shopping. Now, this did come with a lot of people grumbling about the fact that they were essentially making money off of these goods, and it kind of stepped into an uncomfortable territory with this still being a church charity situation, but charging money. But it worked very well, and a number of other groups started doing much the same thing. The Salvation Army in the UK is one that's very well known as well, and both Goodwill and Salvation Army have spread around the world, have hundreds of different stores, and are still staples of the secondhand market today. So the system that they came up with of modernizing how they were doing this and sort of legitimizing it in a different way really helped change a lot of the stigma around secondhand clothing. And this was very useful because of that growth of the wardrobe that was occurring, especially once we reached the 20th century. We start getting into synthetics, everything being ready-made and mass-produced and fast fashion, and so many really dramatic fashion changes from year to year, more and more technology. People are willingly giving away things that they don't want anymore just to make room in their house. So there's a really huge intake of goods that do well in the secondhand market, and then the people who are giving them away, of course, feel a little morally better about the amount of stuff that they are consuming. During World War I, this was an absolutely necessary thing, not just for supplying the soldiers with the things that they would need overseas, but also in making sure that the war-torn areas could get what they needed in terms of basic clothing and other goods. And of course, there was massive inflation post-war. There were all of these soldiers coming back that suddenly needed new regular civilian clothing, and there was a great shortage of textiles and other goods which were coming very often out of European areas that were dealing with a lot of difficulties, so things like secondhand clothing became necessary back home as well. By the 1920s, they had started to open up to a whole new range of customers. They still relied very heavily on the immigrant population needing new clothes, but they were also seeing a really big influx of middle-class women, especially young women who were business girls or maybe were in the theater and actresses where they needed nice clothing.
Would you say that you've done a lot of thrifting? Would you say that you see a lot of young women, middle class women at the thrift stores? Do you say that the majority?
There's all kinds of people that do it, honestly.
I'm just wondering how much these vestiges from the past have moved forward to the present. You know?
But they were out on their own and didn't have a ton of money for fancy clothes, but they needed more than they ever had before. They also apparently had a lot of wives and daughters of underpaid civil service workers or middle-class women who had perhaps gambled a little bit too much at bridge or cards that week and needed to balance the household budget by buying some cheaper clothing so that way the husband didn't notice. But even with growing demand for the consumption of secondhand clothing, a lot of it was still being shipped overseas. Well, after World War I had settled down and things had normalized, they were still sending a lot of these things internationally to any place that was dealing with war or famine, natural disasters. They were also starting to send out a lot more clothing and the mindset of westernizing. So to places that they felt were behind the times and needed to come into the modern world and westernize, they would send a lot of the secondhand clothing, very often as part of missions. Now, what really took the last little bit of stigma away from secondhand clothing started up in the 1970s. There was this massive boom of what they by then started calling thrift shops. And they had a young audience that was looking for alternatives to regular fashion. They wanted to be more creative, but they also really didn't have a budget for new clothing. There was a lot of inflation during that time period as well, and the quality of clothing was going down.
My parents always talk about the 1970s and the inflation and the interest rates being 20%. Can you imagine? We think interest rates are high now. 20% interest, they had that in the 70s. I still
think housing is really difficult now. I think that it's not really a comparison, but yes.
20% interest rates?
Well, I think that interest rates are its own thing, but inflation is a separate thing.
Yeah. Well, they had
and
both.
like
she's saying they had both.
Yes.
In the 70s. So,
and also like cost of living.
Yeah.
It's a separate thing.
Yeah.
Very fast. There was also a trend for retro styles. So the 20s, 30s, and 40s went through different trend cycles in the 70s and 80s. So a lot of people went to secondhand stores to find some older clothing items that resembled that style. So it was also that vintage trend that helped normalize the purchasing of secondhand clothing. By today, it is, as I said, its own entire community and culture in terms of purchasing. Giving away of clothing to secondhand stores is also a really big business. We're dealing with modern excess and poor quality even more than we ever had before. And the interesting thing is, despite the fact that a lot of people will donate their clothing expecting it to then go to a good cause, less than 10% is actually resold domestically in stores. A good chunk of things are simply thrown out because they aren't usable, they aren't of value, they're too far gone, they aren't good quality, whatever it may be.
I know that when I was in my undergraduate college years, I got a one individual sofa chair that I got for free from the street. I thought it looked great. I thought it was amazing. And then it was time to move out. We were trying to donate it anywhere. Nowhere would take it. They were like, this is past its prime. We won't take it. And I was like, do I have to throw it out? It's a good chair. And we ended up finding another college kid who was like, I can't pay for anything. Please, any furniture. But, oh, man, even things that you think are like, oh, this is a good item.
By the way,
passes prime.
If you live in a college town, seriously,
oh yeah,
these kids will put stuff out on the streets when they move, like really expensive stuff.
Yeah,
the thrifting in college towns is amazing.
Not even just thrifting,
but yeah, the free stuff,
just free stuff.
Yeah,
we found a grill one time, just on this, like a black stone grill, I can't express to you. I live in Seattle near the University of Washington, and the amount of stuff I see that there were there was a snowboard that becomes skis
at the end of the quarter. That's where
the end of summer quarter, right before summer quarter starts, like the 2 weeks, even that whole month, just drive around the university, those dorms. There is incredible. There was like full on artworks, signed artwork. Yeah, incredible. Crazy. Anyway.
And a good portion of the rest actually still gets shipped out internationally. In terms of the international clothing trade, new and old, 10% of it by weight is used clothing that is being shipped around globally. In fact, a quarter of all US donations end up going international. And this has definitely become a major point of conversation over the last few years, trying to look at how this might have both a negative and positive impact in areas.
Who knows? Australia?
Some of the local textile and clothing trades in areas where there is a glut of the secondhand clothing coming in. There's also, of course, the fact that so much of this comes with that really uncomfortable idea of colonization, westernization, emissions. So there's a question of, should we really be sending all of these American branded goods to places in a way that feels almost like advertisement? It's a very complex and difficult thing. And there is not a simple answer to this on the global scale, but on an individual level, what I at least can recommend for everyone, if you can, when you go to donate clothing, rather than necessarily taking it to a really large international store, see if you have any local places that.
And with that, guess what your local. Guess whose local places? Resellers are local, and they are gonna.
Yeah, we'll take your donations.
We'll take your clothes. Sure. I have to go soon.
Okay.
So I just wanted to say, I think this video, I was really excited to share this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah,
that
I thought it was a really interesting thing.
I got to react to that.
I feel like because of that stigma, we don't hear a lot about the past of reselling, especially with clothing.
Right. And so interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was a really just wild thing to learn about.
Yeah, appreciate it.
So yeah. All right.
Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye.